You have Pentagon officials saying that the CCP is refusing to communicate with the US military on all levels.
Chinese state-sponsored hackers had compromised critical U.S. cyber infrastructure across numerous industries. I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjakovich. And we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Weird Wednesday. So while we've been focusing on this political clown show that is taking place with the upcoming primary and all the ongoing drama that's happening with Trump and DeSantis, what nobody is talking about is what else is happening in the world, and specifically things that are going on with China and Russia. And so Stephanie and I are going to fill you guys in on what's been happening over the past few weeks, because there's a lot. So last weekend, the G7 met in Japan, and they basically agreed that they were going to tighten sanctions against Moscow, and they're urging China to press Russia to withdraw from the Ukraine. And they're stressing the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And in case you don't know who the players are in the G7, it's the United States, France, the UK, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada. That's 7. Yes. Okay. So during this conference, the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he stated that China poses the greatest challenge to global security and prosperity in our time. And I totally agree with that. And collectively, the G7 is basically bringing greater sanctions against Russia. And basically, with the war in Ukraine, it's shifted the power dynamic globally, right? So it's bringing all the G7 allies closer together. And I read an article in the Epoch Times that was talking about how potentially the US has the capability to step up as a leader in the world, encouraging our allies to shift trade and investment away from China, relocate manufacturing to places like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other nations that are ally friendly, which in turn also helps them develop economically instead of allowing them to be co-opted by China, which in theory, that sounds great, right? But let's be honest here. With the Biden administration in bed with China and nobody respecting this administration, I highly doubt the US is going to step up as a leader in anything unless it's like an LGBTQIA pride parade. But the interesting thing here is that even though the G7 is standing together with these sanctions, they aren't outright condemning China. And basically, they're just playing the middleman and stressing this need to be cooperative with China. And what this boils down to is that the G7 is afraid to upset Beijing because it will fuck up trade with China, because everyone's doing trade with China. And so the CCP, who was not part of this summit, their response was basically to say that the real threat to global security is the G7 and not China. So then a few days after this summit, last Wednesday, Russia's Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, he went to Beijing and he met with Xi Jinping and with the China Premier Li Qiang. I don't know if I said that right. But anyway, he met with them to basically sign a set of agreements with China to strengthen their economic relationship against the war in Ukraine. So now you have this agreement with Russia and China that basically includes a deep investment of cooperation in their trading services. They put a pact together to export agricultural products to China. And then there's some other kind of agreement about sports cooperation. But you have Russia's energy shipments to China are projected to rise 40% this year. And an Interfax News article reported that these two countries are discussing technological equipment supplies to Russia as well. And then another little known fact is that a few weeks ago, on May 4th, Russia announced that it was opening up its Far East port of Vladivostok to China for, quote, domestic trade shipping. And what this means is that their transport costs will be reduced because there's no import or export duties. But why is this significant? Well, according to a current affairs commentator for the Epoch Times, Yang Ning, quote, once the CCP invades Taiwan, the West will definitely impose sanctions on the CCP. It is possible the U.S. military will cut off the supply to the CCP on routes such as through the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal. Then the CCP ships can use Vladivostok to take the Arctic route. So now you have Moscow and Beijing that are basically accusing NATO of being aggressive and interfering in their sovereign affairs. And then at the same time, the West and NATO are increasing their support for the Ukraine and Taiwan. So there's this very obvious series of alliances emerging here. And you have both the CCP and the West talking about how they don't want a Cold War. But realistically, that's where we're headed, right? And another thing this article pointed out was that the difference between having a Cold War now and having a Cold War like we had back with the Soviet Union, the difference is that we continue to trade with China on a massive scale. So what are we doing? We're essentially funding the CCP. And then on top of that, what's also concerning, you have Pentagon officials saying that the CCP is refusing to communicate with the US military on all levels. Apparently, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, several regional commanders, and then some civilian DOJ employees have all attempted to set up meetings with the CCP, and their attempts have either been rejected or just straight up ignored. And now there's an upcoming annual international security summit that's going to be happening in Singapore. And Secretary Austin requested to meet with, I guess, what is his Chinese counterpart, and he's gotten no response. And so all of this is happening at the same time that China is doubling down on their aggressive moves to modernize their military, and they're consistently threatening Taiwan. So these are real issues that are going on that nobody's paying attention to.
No, that's extremely concerning that they're not having talks with our military. I mean, that is not good at all. And what happened to the Biden administration saying like, oh, once Trump's out, the adults will be back in the room? Like, act like a fucking adult and go and work this out. Because what a lot of people might not think about every day when we talk about China as the bad guy and like going to war is that, like you said, we get everything from them. And it's not just the finished product. We get our raw materials from them as well. We don't produce hardly anything in the United States anymore. And so we're like cutting off our supply of like everything we need by engaging in this, which is exactly where we're headed. And you mentioned a Cold War. I feel like we're already in a Cold War. Like, I feel like we've been, at least with Russia. But speaking of Taiwan, I found a CNBC article by Rohan Goswami that was really concerning. The article stated that, quote, Microsoft warned Wednesday that Chinese state-sponsored hackers had compromised critical U.S. cyber infrastructure across numerous industries with a focus on gathering intelligence. So the Chinese hacking group, codenamed Volt Typhoon, has operated since mid-2021. And the organization is apparently working to disrupt critical communication infrastructure between the United States and Asia. So this is like terrifying and, you know, makes me think about the whole spy balloon and how freaking Biden let it go across the entire nation, collecting data probably from all of our major military bases that it went over. But anyhow, the NSA put out a bulletin on this, and apparently U.S. intelligence has known about this since February, around the same time that Chinese spy balloon flew over the country. So what's really concerning is that this infiltration was focused on communications infrastructure in Guam, which is alarming to the U.S. intelligence because Guam sits at the heart of an American military response in case of invasion of Taiwan. So it's leading people to speculate that China is gearing up as we speak to invade Taiwan, which, as we know, would very well lead to World War III.
Well, speaking of World War III, Stephanie, I laugh because this is funny, but it's not. There was an article last week in the New York Post, and it was talking about how China basically recently they have this new war game simulation system, and they used it to blow up the world's largest aircraft carrier, which is the USS Gerald Ford. And in this simulation, they used a volley of 24 hypersonic missiles. And the results of the simulation were made public in a paper that was published by the Chinese language Journal of Test and Management Technology. And in this simulated scenario, what happened was like So there were repeated warnings from China that the US ignored. And so US vessels continued to approach an island that was being claimed by China in the disputed South China Sea. And so China's response was to fire off these missiles in a three-wave attack. And some of them they fired from as far away as the Gobi Desert. And during this attack, quote, nearly every US surface vessel was shattered by the attack and eventually sank in the simulation. So countries use these simulations all the time when they're preparing for their military efforts. And Chinese researchers are claiming that this simulation proves that the USS Gerald Ford, which is considered to be like completely unsinkable by conventional weapons, like, you know, the Titanic of American warships, they're saying that it, quote, can be destroyed with certainty, end quote, by a relatively small number of these hypersonic strikes. And this article stated that the study was released conveniently not long after top secret documents were leaked online, revealing that China has deployed intermediate range hypersonic missiles that can hit targets thousands of miles away with a high probability of penetrating our US defenses. And apparently, these leaked documents come from confidential Pentagon papers that have been uploaded to online message boards since late last year. At least this is what federal investigators are saying. And Stephanie, remember back in April when the FBI arrested that 21-year-old Air National Guardsman for leaking a bunch of sensitive information?
Yep.
Yeah, well, I guess this was part of that. So whether this is a simulation or not, like, this is some scary shit. And then
it's very scary. And it's even more scary that Biden is in charge of our country right now, because that gives me like zero hope that we could defend ourselves.
Right. Yeah. And on top of that, just prior to the G7 summit, the Chinese Navy was like flexing during this 12-day military exercise that they did around the Japanese Sendo Islands near Okinawa. And according to the Japanese Ministry of Defense, the whole point of this was basically to show off the CCP's military force, because instead of doing their normal path around the island, they were splitting ships and like doing some very different kind of method and operations. And apparently on May 20th, Yahoo Japan reported that two CCP vessels intruded into Japanese territorial waters near the Senkaku Islands, and that this is the 14th time this year that a Chinese vessel has entered Japanese territorial waters. So they're like playing fuck games. And like, this is some really scary shit.
It is scary. And I kind of feel like we talked about this on a previous episode, or maybe I just researched it, but all of these like little islands around China has set up like full force military bases. I mean, they are so freaking equipped, like they are prepping for a world war. Yes. And what really raises a red flag for me, and I was like, fuck, this is not good, was I was watching some news clips of what's happening at the border, which again, like nobody's reporting on, by the way. Like, this is a huge situation. And there are thousands of military-aged Chinese men coming through our southern border. They're coming through like alone. They're all, you know, look like they're in their 20s. And what's weird is that from January to March, there were 2,200 Chinese men that came over the border. There were only 71 during that same time frame a year ago. So why all of a sudden are all of these Chinese people coming through the southern border? And like, why, you know, not fly directly here and just overstay their visa? Well, probably because they're not allowed here, because there's something that would flag them and not allow them to come into the country. And we also know from previous episodes that China has bought land all over the US, right next to our military bases. So like, could these thousands of Chinese men be headed there so that they have boots on the ground here and the likelihood of war breaking out? Like, am I just being overreactive here? But like, I think this is pretty damn concerning.
Well, it is. And then so I started like trying to figure out if there was anything, you know, online about this. And I found an article on its Texas Public Radio website. And they were saying that these Chinese migrants, like they fly from China to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to Turkey, and then Turkey to Istanbul, and then Istanbul to Ecuador, because apparently Ecuador is like the only country in South America that is visa free for Chinese visitors. And then from there, they move north through Ecuador to the Mexican border and cross into the US. Like, that's a big fucking trip, right? And supposedly they're coming here because many of them were small business owners whose businesses got destroyed during the COVID lockdowns. So they're coming to America to start their businesses in like quota free country. But who knows? Like, that's a huge increase. And it's an awfully roundabout long way to illegally enter the country.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning. I mean, it's not just people coming from South America. Like, there's people coming from all over the world. And when we're on the brink of war, like a world war, I don't think we should just be letting thousands, well, let me rephrase, millions of people over our southern border. Like, this is just crazy. And the news article I watched, it was like this news anchor was pissing me off because she's basically talking to this Chinese guy of like, okay, so how can you help more people like you in your country come to America? And she's basically like saying, come on over. And I'm thinking, it's just strange to me. Like, if that's the case, why aren't they coming with their families?
Right.
Where are the women and children and parents? It's all young 20-something-year-olds coming by themselves. And it just looks very suspicious. So I don't know. It's very unsettling. And again, like, I wish there was someone that I felt had any type of negotiating skills at this point, because we're getting to that point where it's going to be too late to negotiate anything. And unfortunately, like, we're being distracted with a lot of nonsense when this will affect everyone. I mean, it's definitely going to affect you and I and everyone listening if we get into a war and we don't have any supplies because everything freaking comes from China. So we'll keep everyone posted on that, since the media is not really talking about it a whole lot. But anyhow, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you back here in a couple days. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you get our latest episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you could, please rate and review the show. We are going to be reading every single review, and I would love it if you hopped over to Instagram at Unapologetically Outspoken and say hi. We want to see who's out there and start a conversation, plus get all of the topics that you want us to talk about next. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.